If you're like us, you're probably tired of flipping through outdated and expensive regulation books and struggling to understand the rule or guidance you're after. eRigs is the first web and mobile app version of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, helping fleets of all types and sizes better access and understand their regulatory obligations. eRigs is always up to date and allows fleet safety professionals to not only read the rules, but also dig into FMCSA guidance and learn more about complex regulatory topics from industry experts. Highlight, bookmark, and take detailed notes right from the app and access them on any of your devices. And easily share a digital version of the regulations with your drivers so that they too can better understand the rules. eRigs was developed by safety professionals for safety professionals. Try it out for free at erigs.app. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 57 of Trucksafe Live, show where we and our guests tackle the hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon with Trucksafe and Childress Law, both of which are dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting edge safety programs. Got Brian Runnels, Rob Carpenter with me today. Guys, what's up?
Not a whole lot.
Howdy. What up?
Do you like that new intro? You both made the cut on the new intro video there.
It's about time.
Yeah, it's good. I forgot you changed the music.
Yeah, I had to because we got a video pulled for a copyright strike on royalty-free music that I had purchased. So I don't know what was going on with that, but yeah. Anyway, I just said screw it and did a whole new intro video. It was time anyway. Not that anybody cares, but appreciate y'all tuning in today. If you're here with us, say hey in the comments so we know who's around. Got a lot of shows going on this month. We did one last week. We're going to do one next week. We've got this one here in the middle. A lot going on from a regulatory perspective that is worth commenting on. So appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us. Today we are talking about crackdown on CDL training providers. That was the big news from last week, December of 2025, when we're recording this. So that's what we're going to break down here in a minute. Before we do, I want to thank the sponsor of this episode, which is Project 61. It aims to improve the life expectancy of CDL drivers by raising awareness, providing resources, and educating drivers on a healthier lifestyle. Learn how you can support the movement over at project-61.org. Thanks to those guys for helping us out. A few things going on at Trucksafe. Again, if you're not a member of the Trucksafe network, I'd encourage you to join it. Free to join over at trucksafenetwork.com or scan that QR code and download the app in the App Store or the Google Play Store. This is the space that we've built for safety professionals, fleet safety professionals, to gather together, learn from one another, ask questions, and access all of our DOT-related content. So hope to see you over there. Also, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter, trucksafe.com/subscribe, which is where we send out breaking news, our analysis of it, and again, all kinds of free content that's available to help fleets better understand this regulatory environment. So yeah, do that. Free. Before we get to the topic, the main topic of today, there were a few other news stories, as I said, several, that are worth mentioning. The first that I will point out is this one, which we actually highlighted in our show last week. And it has to do with FMCSA tightening the reins on the electronic logging device self-certification process. If you missed this show, it was a great one. We had Tom Cuthbertson on as a guest to talk about this crackdown and what FMCSA is doing in terms of more thorough vetting, hopefully, of electronic logging device manufacturers. What we're seeing is pretty rampant fraud when it comes to these devices not meeting the technical specifications and allowing drivers and carriers to improperly edit drive time on their devices, and also offshore actors getting involved in, editing drivers' duty status, all, falsification, log falsification type issues. And that has gotten FMCSA's attention, and it is a byproduct of the way that we certify these devices in the U.S., which is completely different than how Canada does it. In fact, ours isn't any kind of certification process at all. It's a self-certification process where the device manufacturers essentially just say, trust me, that my device meets these technical specifications. And so you end up with thousands of devices on the self-certification list. Carriers buy up some of the lesser-known devices, and turns out they're not compliant at all. And then that leaves the carriers and the drivers in a bad place because those devices get yanked from the list, and now that carrier is going to have to go reinvest in a new solution anyway. So because of those problems, FMCSA has announced that it intends to more closely vet these training providers, or not training providers, ELD providers, going forward. What exactly that means, it's a little too early to tell. But we had a great conversation about that on the last show of what it could look like and how it differs from Canada's system. So be sure to check that out, trucksafelive.com. Guys, you have any thoughts on that crackdown?
Good, Rob. You're the ELD guy, man. You go ahead and touch base on that one first.
No, the only thing I was going to say, it kind of touches on our show today. Everything is self-certification. Everything is self-attesting. So I think at some point you have to kind of say, there has to be some point where there's some kind of validation besides self-attesting or attestation. So whether it's ELDT or ELDs, it's the same issue.
Yeah, FMCSA likes its self-certification list, coming to find out. So we've got the ELD, we've got the training provider registry, and we've also got the National Registry of Medical Examiners, all of which are self-certified lists, folks claiming that they are compliant with the rules. And then if it turns out that they're not, then we only catch them after the fact, if we catch them at all, after folks have already had problems, run into enforcement problems and stuff like that. So huge issue. I mean, that's just the nature of a self-certification process. And so now we're starting to see that there have been enough complaints raised to FMCSA that it is stepping in not only in the ELD context, but as we'll talk about here on this show, the training provider registry as well. So that was one issue I wanted to mention. Again, go back and watch that show if you're interested. It was last week, trucksafelive.com. Here's some other news I saw come out within the last couple of weeks. This is kind of the ongoing saga of the non-domiciled CDL interim final rule that FMCSA passed a couple months ago. This is something we've been following at Trucksafe and also Childress Law. Folks will remember maybe that the FMCSA issued that emergency rule, which severely cut back on the eligibility, who's eligible to receive these so-called non-domiciled CDLs. And it went into effect immediately. It essentially bypassed the normal notice and comment period that typical rulemaking goes through, federal rulemaking, and made pretty big splash immediately. Several state licensing agencies stopped issuing them altogether as a result of that move, and had lots of people up in arms about it. Well, unsurprisingly, ended up with a federal lawsuit being filed against FMCSA by some drivers who were impacted by the rule and also some interest groups. And the court in that case, D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, originally put a pause on the FMCSA's rule, a temporary stay. And then more recently, the development that we've seen is that the FMCSA actually went in and filed a motion to hold the case in abeyance, meaning holding it paused, until it could essentially go back and review the 8,000 comments that were submitted in the docket for that rule and go through the process that it should have just gone through in the beginning, which is the formal notice and comment period. And it indicated to the court that it intends to go through that process now and issue a final rule based on its review of those 8,000 comments. So that's what it's working towards. I don't know why they didn't just pursue that from the beginning, because now they've just had to spend a lot of money defending themselves in this lawsuit, and it's left people, carriers and drivers and state licensing agencies with a lot of uncertainty over the last couple of months. And so here we are. So that's the latest development. that rule is not effective right now because it's under stay by that DC Circuit Court of Appeals. So FMCSA is going to go back to the drawing board potentially after it reviews those comments and come out with a final rule that, if I had to guess, will probably be similar to, but probably not quite as as I don't know what word I would use. Probably not quite as aggressive as the interim final rule was. That would be my estimation. Thoughts on this, guys?
A couple thoughts on this real quick. One, that doesn't stop the enforcement of, drivers that are out there that are already on the expired work visas, and even though they have a current license, that's not stopping the enforcement of pulling those drivers off the road. And a thing that we've started to see, quite honestly, at TVC is drivers that have been cited for this roadside. The officers are not pulling them off the road right there. They're not getting involved in this immigration side. Mm-hmm. They're issuing citations, and this has happened in Alabama. They're issuing citations where the driver has to appear in court. It's not an issue where they can hire an attorney or they can hire an attorney, but the driver still has to show up in court, and then they're getting arrested at court.
What are they cited for? What's the violation you're usually seeing?
I think it's not having a active work. You know what? I don't know exactly what the citation is. This is just something that we saw in Alabama recently. And now the driver has to show up in court and they're getting arrested there.
Yeah, I mean, it's just another one of those debacles where the way that it was handled ends up with all kinds of confusion from all different stakeholders that could have probably been avoided had we have just gone through the normal process that's set out to avoid this type of confusion, which is the normal rulemaking process. Because now you're right. Now, some of the states that had stopped issuing the non-domiciled CDLs are saying that, hey, we stopped that and we're not going to continue doing it, even despite the court's pause. And other states are saying, okay, we're going to turn it back on. And so now you're left with a patchwork of state laws and how they're handling this issue. And so if you're a carrier that has operations in multiple states, now you're having to look up what are the rules in all of these different states, how are they handling it. So not a great look for the agency, not a great place to be for carriers or drivers who are using these types of licenses, or drivers that have these types of licenses.
I think we'll see more targeted enforcement like we saw in Oklahoma, Indiana, Arkansas, where ICE is setting up in scale houses and they're checking CDLs and they're going to check them against work permits, and they're going to pull drivers off the road. So this stay on the law does not stop that from happening.
Yeah, we saw that in Indiana too, right? A big blitz.
Yeah, it was like 93 drivers I think they got.
Yeah. So be on the lookout for that. We will continue posting any updates that we receive. We're tracking that lawsuit. There's not going to be much development on that lawsuit because, like I said, it's held in abeyance pending the FMCSA's action on the rulemaking. If I had to guess, the next thing that we'll see is going to be some kind of a rulemaking notice from FMCSA, probably in January would be my best guess. So be on the lookout for that newsletter. Our newsletter is where you could get up-to-date information on that. Trucksafe.com/subscribe. All right, last thing I wanted to mention before we move into today's topic. Rob's been publishing a bunch of articles over at FreightWaves. Be sure to follow him over there. Rob, you posted this article about FMCSA's new modus registration system and kind of a modernization of their registration system. You want to kind of walk us through basically what it entails?
Yeah,
or do you even remember
really
what you wrote?
Oh yeah. It's really meant to streamline registration process for carriers. That's really it. I mean, we're kind of in the Stone Age. We've kind of used the same one forever, and now they're updating it. It did kick off this month, but I think it really truly rolls out in January, I think.
And it rolls out in a kind of a staggered or a stepped pattern, right? So the first rollout is really a change for insurance providers and BOC3 agents and how they have to register in the system to be able to make filings on behalf of their motor carrier clients, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. But eventually it's going to roll out. It's going to be a whole new system for even motor carriers too. And then from what I could tell, and we covered this back at Matt's, I remember talking about this because they had a whole team. FMCSA had a whole registration team at Matt's talking about this rollout. And it's heavily focused on fraud prevention. So there's going to be some additional levels of identity verification baked into the new system once it rolls out. And this is also the same change that was originally supposed to see the end of MC numbers for carriers that have to have for-hire operating authority. It was originally planned that we were going to do away with those and instead just have the USDOT number serve as the single point of, single identifying registration number. But I think they came off of that, didn't they? That's not going to take effect in any time in the near future.
It was supposed to go in effect in October, and it didn't. So I emailed FMCSA and was like, hey, where are we on this? And they honestly said, they've responded back and basically said it's to be determined. We haven't made our mind up yet. Was essentially the written response that I got. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
And then here we are with Modus. So I think from that gesture, we are not changing this rule.
Not going to happen.
That's
Okay.
what it sounds like.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. Okay, so obviously, like I said, a lot going on in the industry from a regulatory standpoint. On today's show, we wanted to touch on another one of those topics coming out of FMCSA this month, again, December of 2025, if you're watching later, which is the announcement that it is tightening the reins on entry-level driver training providers and has taken action to remove 3,000 training providers, as of the date of this recording, from the training provider registry, with 4,000 more providers in the crosshairs. So this move raises many questions, including some foundational ones like, is the CDL training system as a whole broken? And so I know you guys have lots of thoughts on this, having both been training providers in past lives yourselves and also CDL holders yourselves. So you guys wrote a great article that we published over at Trucksafe. If anybody's interested in checking that out, you can check it out there. But I also wanted to get you on here to get your thoughts about this. I know you've got lots of them. So I guess first things first, maybe what we'll do is we'll start off by looking at this announcement from FMCSA to clear up any kind of fake news that's out there on what exactly it does. So here I'm just going to read the notice that FMCSA published. Actually, USDOT published this. It's titled, Trump's Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy cracks down on illegal providers of commercial driver's license test training centers. Then it goes on to say that Sean Duffy has announced the removal of nearly 3,000 CDL training providers from the FMCSA's training provider registry for failing to equip trainees with the Trump administration's standards of readiness. Another 4,500 training providers were placed on notice due to potential noncompliance. And here's a quote from Sean Duffy, Transportation Secretary. He says, this administration is cracking down on every link in the illegal trucking chain. Under Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg, bad actors were able to game the system and let unqualified drivers flood our roadways. Their negligence endangered every family on America's roadways, and it ends today. Under President Trump, we are reining in illegal and reckless practices that let poorly trained drivers get behind the wheel of semi-trucks and school buses. Goes on to say, the training provider registry lists all providers authorized to offer federally required entry-level driver training for CDL students. It's the first step in FMCSA's review of the 16,000 training providers listed on the registry to identify and remove non-compliant providers. These providers are being removed from the TPR due to what USDOT says is falsifying or manipulating training data, neglecting to meet required curriculum standards, facility conditions, or instructor qualifications, and failing to maintain accurate, complete documentation or refusing to provide records during federal audits or investigations. Notice goes on a little bit, but that's about all the detail they have on the action that they are taking at the moment. I have talked with some clients that have reported that they have gotten audit notices about about these types of audits. And I know you guys have looked at the training provider registry and see some familiar names on the registry that have been revoked. And so they are doing something here. And but I think after discussions with you guys, the question is it really as aggressive as it seems in that notice? So that's what we'll talk about. But maybe we'll start with initial question here. What surprised you guys most about this announcement of the nearly 3,000 training providers that were removed from the registry?
Well, for the notice, I would say what surprised me the most was where they got their numbers from. So it said in the notice that there was 16,000 in the registry, but there's actually like 36,000.
Yeah, that didn't make any sense to
me. I don't
me.
know where they got it. Yeah, I don't know where those numbers came from, especially since it was the government that put the numbers out. But it's their ELDT program that has 36,000, not 16. But then it's how many actually got yanked off, right? There's only 3,000 or 4,000. I mean, some others got put under notice, but that's a drop in the bucket to 36. So there's a lot lower when we're talking public, but after there you go. So now you're at, I don't know, 35,
over
providers.
Close to 35,000 providers. So the 16, even if you just do public enrollment only, that doesn't even get close to 16. So yeah, I'm with you. I don't know where they got the 16,000 number.
But I think what's kind of the bigger shocking factor beyond the data element is you have to look at who's in the registry. I mean, there's all kinds of, there's church groups, there's Boy Scouts, there's things that really they don't affect us hardly at all, right? So I don't know to what extent it'll actually help the issues. I think for me, if you go back and look at ELDT as a whole, one issue for me is the duration of it. It really is just a two-piece thing from the federal government. One, you have the registry, which is all the feds do. They have a registry where you can go in and log in and sign up to be a provider, and that's it. And then they provide a curriculum, but they don't even provide duration times for completion, and they do not provide any content to go with the curriculum. So it's a really fractured system across the board. And then you've
got an outline of required topics, right?
Yeah, that's it. So it's all reliant on what each individual state is actually putting together. So,
somebody on YouTube with the handle broken CDL system. Wonder what his thoughts are on this system. Is saying the FMCSA must look at themselves how they have watered down the ELDT program. I think we are all kind of in agreement that is the truth. Although I will say, I mean, remember back, you don't have to remember back too far before ELDT, which was just prior to 2022. We didn't have any kind of entry-level driver training requirement. Anybody could go, as long as they could go past the test at their DMV, they could get a CDL, maybe with no training whatsoever. And so watered down, I guess, in the sense that watered it down from what it could have been based on the original proposal. And I think that's what Rob is getting at, which is in the original proposal for the ELDT that the FMCSA had envisioned, there were things like minimum hours requirements and maybe some more in-depth discussion of what the curriculum would require, but not watered down in the sense of what we had sometime in the past.
Yeah, and I think even his comment, what was the name of that guy?
Broken CDL system.
Yeah, in terms of looking at FMCSA, actually, Jack was there at the time at FMCSA, and I know that they put a lot of effort into this program. And the way that it was originally drafted, like you said, it had a lot of these pieces in it originally, and then you had policymakers who gutted it, and then when it became an actual reg, it was completely different than the original intention.
Well, so policymakers likely at the behest of the interest groups that inevitably get involved in the rulemaking process and lobby to get things taken out of the rule that the FMCSA had originally intended, no doubt.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go there, but since you did.
I'm not going to name who those interest groups are, but I'm just saying.
Yeah.
All right, Brian, I know you're chomping at the bit here. Let's hear it.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I want to address on this. You kind of touched on it. The job of a school is to get someone to pass the test. That is all. And, they put all this extra theory into the ELDT. Well, as long as that can be done online, there's going to be fraud. if I'm not that strong in that stuff, shoot, I'll have Rob do it. And Rob can make a few bucks doing it for me, him, anybody else that wants to do it. The actual behind the wheel stuff, that didn't change all that much from what was previously put out there. So if you can pass the test, the school's job is complete, and they succeeded in what they had to do. And I know we're kind of leading down towards what happens after that, and that's where the epic failure is in the program. So let's kind of keep it in context of what these training providers' job actually is and how much blame we should actually put there, because it's not near as much as somebody that takes these drivers after the fact and completely fails them on training them and getting them ready to have a job out on the road.
So let's go there. So you've run a training program in the past.
Yep.
Was it for a carrier specifically, or was it an independent training program? I can't remember.
It was for a carrier.
Okay. So when you were running that program, I mean, what was your philosophy behind what it was that you were doing? What did you view your role as in the whole process?
To put a driver out there better than any school could possibly do. And, we had it set up. They came to us with a permit, and that was it. And we trained them to the test to get them to pass the test. And then our trainer program was very well put together. Our trainers did a great job. And we would have them out with a trainer for somewhere 4 to 6 weeks as a solo. And even when I was training over the road, I didn't think of this program all, on my own. This was a program that I was involved in. A new driver doesn't learn if the truck's being operated as a team. I'll argue that with anybody. A student's not learning if the trainer's in the bunk and vice versa. So, giving them the 4 to 6 weeks of one-on-one instruction instead of trying to make your training program a profit center by running extra miles with cheap labor because it's a student, that makes a world of difference. And, it even comes down to pay structure, how you pay your trainers. If they have a vested interest in a student succeeding and they're seeing a piece of that for a certain period of time after the student gets out, that's your profit center, both for your trainer and for the company. So yeah, I've got a bunch of those bullet points in my head on what makes a good training program, but we see it so often that there's companies that either just put a student out for a week or two with somebody. They say, okay, yeah, you can drive. And those are the ones we see the videos of that they can't even back up because they haven't had experience backing more than 2 or 3 times. If that, or the trainer just said, yeah, let me do it. Or, somebody that went through a quote unquote 4 to 6 week program, but was completely exhausted because they were running nights the whole time while their trainer slept. Yeah. It happens every day. I know it's happening, but programs that I put together, they were not set up like that. They were documented weekly. And you also have to give your trainers the ability to say, this isn't working out, and not override them. If you can't trust your trainers, then either A, you shouldn't have a program, or B, that driver shouldn't be a trainer.
So let me ask you this. Do you think it was a mistake then that we even came out with this whole ELDT concept? Because if it's not serving a purpose other than to get somebody to pass the test, and it's not making them a safer driver, then what's really the point of it? Why would regulators be concerned about putting a program in place that just teaches to the test without generating, or were they under the delusion that this was going to result in safer drivers?
Yeah, they're ignorant to the fact that of what the school's jobs are. They just saw that, it's low hanging fruit. Hey, we'll put all these extra rules on the very, very beginning of a driver's career. and that'll make everything better.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it was very well thought out. And
It's probably
once
a
again,
Band-Aid, because
Mhm.
FMCSA is always under pressure. Usually after bad accidents, especially if the NTSB gets involved, NTSB starts making recommendations to how do we prevent these really bad accidents from happening. If I remember correctly, there were several NTSB recommendations to FMCSA specifically that they mandate some type of formalized training in order to get a CDL. And so, maybe what we have now is just the Band-Aid approach where FMCSA is trying to get NTSB and the public off their back and say, hey, we did something. But it seems like the result is just a bunch of red tape that doesn't make us safer on the back end.
Well, I think one of the ways you can make things more efficient and to make people more proficient is to have a centralized platform. And that's, I think, really what they were shooting for is, hey, if we put this curriculum out there where everybody has to learn and become educated on the following items, then we can at least make it somewhat centralized in what they're learning instead of it's still a fractured program, but it's still not as fractured as it was before, because before it was really the Wild Wild West. Like you said, we didn't have any standards. So it was every school and every state for itself. It's still every state for itself, but they at least have a curriculum that they have to say, yes, we are covering the following modules for behind the wheel theory. And so I think that's good. I just think after it got gutted, it kind of eliminated the need for the entire program because there wasn't enough in there to actually guarantee proficiency with what was in the curriculum.
Well, and it also led to what should have been easily foreseeable, which is this flooding of the market. Anytime the DOT sets up something that's required, and the DOT is not offering the resources to help carriers meet that directly, then it sets up an incentive for the market to be flooded by all these people who just want to make a buck from the fact that carriers and drivers have to check the box in order to meet that standard. And you end up with this inevitable situation where you've got all these training providers trying to make a buck off the fact that the drivers have to just check this box in order to take the next step, which is to go take the test and to pass it. So that seems like an inevitable byproduct of this type of rulemaking, unfortunately.
And that, once again, that's in the control of a motor carrier as well. Because when I was training drivers over the road, we'd get students out of certain schools, and after one or two of them, we'd say, hey, this is not a good idea working with students from these particular schools. And on the other hand, when we get drivers from certain schools, as a trainer, we didn't have to do a whole lot because, man, they were good. And, they knew what they were doing, and it was a really pleasurable experience to train them. So I think that falls on the motor carrier as well to keep track of those and stop using training providers that are putting out garbage.
Yeah.
Because they can put out thousands and thousands of drivers, but if motor carriers aren't using them, they're going to go away.
Yeah. A few comments here. Let's see. Leslie on LinkedIn saying, referring back to something you said, Brian, she said that's a big deal regarding team training, which we did not do at Melton. When I give presentations to students, I highly recommend they avoid teaming. Our trainers sit next to the student to help, guide, coach, and learn the lifestyle of OTR driving.
That's 100% correct. If, the trainer should be sitting there on duty, not driving that whole time. And, she's exactly right. The teaching them the lifestyle. I know trip planning is a complete lost art. So, teaching a driver the trip planning, what to do with your downtime as a solo driver, and things like that, that sets them up for success just as much as knowing how to back into a dock door.
Yeah.
If not more.
Tyler, our colleague Tyler on LinkedIn is saying, but driver shortage, right? FMCSA was probably pressured into making it easier to get drivers qualified based on market/lobbying pressures. Tyler's being sarcastic.
Yeah, he is. And we've seen backing away from that terminology over the last few months from, associations where it's quality over quantity.
Mm-hmm.
So
But yeah, I think he's right. That I'm sure that had a lot to do, or that factored very heavily into the rule that we ended up with, the ELDT rule that we ended up with. Why would we put all of these pressures like minimum time requirements and detailed curriculum in place if we're dealing with a so-called driver shortage? That's just going to eat into the capacity issue. And so, yeah, I have no doubt that played into it.
I mean, there was some other programs that kind of went along. I had touched on this in a group chat that we had and I've never heard anybody mention this program, but when I was in the private equity side, when ELDT came out, we were like, well, what are we going to do? Where are we going to come up with all these drivers? We already have an issue finding drivers for the mode that we're operating in. So I did some digging, created matrices for the requirements for every state to open these ELDT schools as providers in different states where we really needed it. And California has the California Employer Testing Program, where as long as it's not paid, you can train your own employees and you can be a third-party examiner internally and get them their license. So everything is completely in-house as an employer. So it's kind of like the fox guarding the hen house, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So I always think these kind of programs are crazy, but it's not the only one that exists. So I don't know. It's kind of like who's running all of these programs, and it's still so fractured that it's really not one. It's 50 plus.
Yeah. So something, I know both of you already kind of touched on this, but just to get at it more directly, something I wanted to highlight. You both looked through the list of training providers that have been removed and had some interesting findings in the ones that were listed as having been removed. So let's talk about that. Brian, you want to go through that?
Yeah, sure. There's a ton of municipalities in there, police, fire, ambulance training. Like Rob said, we found a few Boy Scout troops, hospitals, what other was in church groups. So yeah, and the amount of different construction type, there you go, right there. There's a construction company.
I know there's a list of the revoked ones. Where's that at? I was going to pull that up. You keep talking. I'm gonna find it.
Yeah, I actually just Googled that, and then went through the list. So, there's a ton of the Village of XYZ. There was a bunch of those. U-Haul had 8. I'm not exactly sure why, but they had 8 entries, because you got to remember that each, and you were informed me of this earlier today. I couldn't remember. If you're doing behind the wheel training, each location has to be registered, and I had forgot about that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of duplicates, triplicates, and types of vehicles that we're not talking about when it comes to what the FMCSA is going after, and what the associations are concerned with. It's ambulances and fire trucks and police cars, and it's different stuff like that.
Yeah, this is to be a little critical of the USDOT and FMCSA. With all due respect, we've seen this a lot with some of their announcements that they've made recently on a lot of these regulatory developments. They'll put out these press releases that will highlight the supposed sweeping action that they've taken to crack down on enforcement. I'm thinking things that come to mind: English language proficiency, non-domiciled CDLs, ELD self-certification, this issue. But then when you start to dig into any one of those, it's pretty quickly obvious to anybody that puts any amount of effort into it that it's not quite as dramatic as what it seems like if you're just to read the press releases, for many of the reasons you mentioned here in this context, Brian. A lot of these, and we also saw this with the ELD self-certification. True enough, there have been hundreds of devices revoked from the self-certification list, but if you start to dig in, you quickly realize that most of those are voluntary revocations by the manufacturers themselves, because either they've come out with a new model of the device or they're just out of business. And so when you look at the ones that the DOT itself revoked, the list gets down to like 60 or 70 within over the last 6 years. So, and the same thing seems to be true here as we're digging into the list of training providers that have been removed from the registry. You start to see some things popping out at you like that. Like, hey, a lot of these are probably entities that aren't even pushing out any drivers. And if they are, maybe it's one or two here or there. These aren't the ones that are pushing out thousands of drivers, at least from what we could tell. So I think that's a problem. I think we should be a little more transparent in the way that we characterize what exactly has been done and what is being done to really get to the root of the issue here.
Well, and I think the low-hanging fruit on this stuff is they probably didn't keep just some of their paperwork requirements up to date. So it made it real easy to take them off.
We saw that with a medical provider registry, right? So earlier this year, I think it was earlier this year, they removed like 15,000 medical examiners from the registry. But then when you dug into it, the reason that they were removed is not because they were doing bogus medical exams. It's because they failed to update their email addresses on the registry. And so likely many of those have been put back on. Because it was just a paperwork issue. So I don't want to say I don't know why we do that, but because I think I do know why we do that. But I think being a little more transparent in the notices is warranted. That's just some friendly advice.
I think one of the things that I found in the registry period is I think they're focusing on a lot of this low-hanging fruit that is clearly, whether Boy Scouts of America, construction companies, things that fire and life and emergency responders, these are all low-hanging fruit, right? Like we kind of may have the idea that this is not necessary. We can remove them easily. I think one of the bigger problems they're going to have is in fraudulent schools is when you have community colleges and universities that are legitimate, and then they're basically contracting out their CDL program to a third-party CDL school, and it's basically the school lending credibility to a bad program that you're not seeing, right? So I think those are the scarier ones. We've had some in Virginia, one of which I played a part in closing down, but it was actually run by the mob, and a community college didn't know it, and
Rob,
they were basically charging
Rob,
people.
as your lawyer, I'm going to advise you to not be talking about your mob connections here on this podcast.
Yeah, they're like 36% interest these people were charging for student loans. So it was basically a contract arrangement with community colleges. So people were seeing community colleges. They're thinking, hey, it's got to be legitimate. They're going and getting these loans, and they're getting educated in how to drive trucks. So it's that's the bigger issue, I think, is trying to weed through the ones that aren't as apparently fraudulent.
All right, so we've identified the problem and some of our concerns with the action that's been taken, and I think we all agree that the system as it is broken, and it's leading to drivers who shouldn't be getting their CDL and operate, and drivers who have their CDL who shouldn't be out there operating without more in-depth training out there operating. It's leading to safety issues. And so if you guys, I'll put it to you guys, if you could go back to the drawing board and design the system from scratch, how would you recommend, or what are some of the major things you would recommend the DOT consider if we were to rework the system?
One would be some sort of, I don't know if I want to use the word registry again, but some sort of program that finishing schools are put in, and they have to actually submit what they're doing. And, all this stuff that was supposed to be on the front end, for ELDT, but now it's on the back end, puts the responsibility on the motor carrier that if you're going to train these drivers and you're going to put them out there, that's where the risk comes in. So they should be responsible for the risk. And, quite honestly, if we've seen crashes with big verdicts, how often do they go back to the school that got them their CDL? Yeah. Never, because it's not, I hate to say it's not that big of a deal as it is who's finishing that student and putting them out there. And if you're training drivers and you're doing a crappy job of it, man, you need to be taken out of the system.
Yeah, putting aside training obligations on motor carriers, one of the things that we always harp on, I know all three of us do, that motor carriers should be doing now that many of them aren't because they're taking advantage of an exemption in the regulations. If they hire CDL drivers, there's an exemption that says they can just accept a copy of their CDL as proof that they're safe to operate in lieu of doing a road test of the driver, actually putting eyes on them and their ability to safely operate their trucks. So a lot of carriers take advantage of that exemption. They don't even put eyes on the driver driving before they just turn them loose in the truck. They just get a copy of their CDL. They think, okay, they got their CDL. They must be properly trained. They're good to go. We all think that's a mistake. We think you should be, even though the regulations don't technically require it, we think you should be putting eyes on all of your drivers that you are putting in the seats. Again, that's putting aside the whole training issue. It's just something, it's low-hanging fruit. It's something you could do easily to mitigate your exposure as the motor carrier that hires those drivers and puts them on the road.
There are some insurance carriers as well. We touched base on this a while back on a different show, but there are insurance carriers that don't require a driver list.
Yeah.
So, you don't road test them. You don't have to really worry about them on your insurance. So sure, why not? That stuff's got to stop.
Yeah. Tyler's responding to something you said, Brian, I think. He said, how can FMCSA meaningfully investigate the training schools for compliance? The agency already doesn't have the manpower to audit carriers for compliance. I think that's the truth. I think that's a big problem.
Huge issue. And, it comes down to any of these registries or any of the initiatives that they want to do. I think, are we down below 1,000 people now in the FMCSA?
So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, and there's 700,000 carriers and 3.5 million drivers that they're supposed to be in charge of. It just, we talk about all this stuff, but it won't happen because they just don't have the manpower to enforce it.
Yeah. All right, Rob, let's hear your thoughts on some of the big picture items that FMCSA could think about if it were to go back to the drawing board on this. You're muted.
Brandon, cut my voice off. I think it's about the substance of the program, really, because you have to go back to the drawing board. There's so much that's not here. It's one thing to develop a curriculum, but then to not have some kind of centralized assessment, whether it's formative or otherwise, that's universal for everybody, that's overseen by one centralized source. So just throwing a curriculum out there and telling everybody in 50 states that are under 50 different rule structures to go register as a provider and then say, we promise to obey the rules of instructor qualifications and school and education requirements for the state of Virginia. Or California or wherever. So I think the big part of it is just like any other fractured program, you have to fix the fractured part of the program and make it more centralized. And that's why a lot of people are saying, why don't we make the CDLs more federal instead of state by state CDL license? And then you could have that centralized federal, basically, review of the whole process and control of the process. But having 50 different hands in the pot, I mean, you wouldn't operate a company and let 50 different terminals say, hey, whatever you want to do at your terminal is good to go. Like, just make sure you kind of follow the policies that you interpret.
No, so CDL program, to respond to that specifically, CDL program, as we all know, is a federally regulated program. And so the baseline rules that govern the different types of classes, Class A, Class B, Class C, all of the different endorsements, all of the different restrictions are developed and implemented at the federal level. So they are uniform from state to state in that sense. But you're right, in terms of administering the program and actually, administering the test and deciding who gets to get these licenses that are governed by the FMCSA, that's all up to the states. And it leads to the inevitable kind of patchwork of quality control at the state level. So, it's a good point. Clint here is also raising another good point. He says the lack of a clear definition of proficient is a huge problem. Current definition is too subjective, huge part of the problem. Do the regulations use the term proficient in this context? Not that I'm aware of, but I think the point is still well taken. how do we decide whether somebody who goes through one of these programs should have been allowed to progress through the program or not?
Well, I mean, it's pretty easy to go CDL, right? I mean, if we're looking at test passing centers versus education providers, you're really looking for basically three things. One, can you name at least 120 parts of a truck, and what can go wrong with those 120 parts? If you can complete that part, can you back straight? Can you back at a 45 and 90 degree within so many attempts? And then can you go out and drive on the highway for 10 minutes with an examiner? And if you can do all three of those things, then you have a CDL. That's not difficult to be proficient in those three things. And that's why a lot of times I say that it was 80% of what I learned was on the highway, not in a school. So I think how you're going to structure the program is going to make a big difference, but there has to be an element of that program that's a lot more than 10 minutes of behind the wheel time with an examiner, and can you back up?
And to make sure I'm clear on your thoughts on this, Brian, when you say that you think carriers should take a more active role in this, are you envisioning a regulatory scheme where they have a regulatory obligation to do that, or are you just saying as best practice they should be more hands-on with this stuff?
Boy, it would be great to say, hey, as a best practice, we're going to do this. But the problem is there's so many bad actors that there has to be something in place that keeps them accountable. I know what we say, we're already regulated to the hilt.
Yep.
Well, agreed, we are, but what's stopping anybody from putting horrible drivers on the road? Right now, there isn't anything stopping that. Because Rob said, if you can do the memorization part of the pre-trip and you can do some basic maneuvering and do a road course, you've got the CDL. So what happens after that?
Yeah,
it would be great to say, yeah, everybody has not only the student's best interest in mind, but the motoring public's best interest in mind. And frankly, that's just not the case in many, many cases.
Folks may not remember, but before the ELDT, as we know it today, went into effect in 2022, there was a carrier requirement on the books to provide what was called entry-level driver training to any drivers that they hired, any CDL drivers that they hired that had less than 1 year of driving experience at another motor carrier. And that regulation said that it was the motor carrier's obligation to provide this training to that group of drivers. And the problem was, it went on to say, here's the topics you have to train them on. And it was like 4 topics. And all it said was like hours of service, driver qualification, vehicle maintenance, and driver wellness was on there. That's what I remember from the rule. And so then it just completely left it up to the carrier to decide how to satisfy their obligation. What it essentially amounted to in many cases was, just like a half-hour conversation or video that they showed to the drivers and then had them fill out a 5-question test, and then they stuffed that in the file. And that's what you ended up with for the carrier-mandated training that existed at the time. That went away with this ELDT requirement, but yeah, I mean, that's tricky for all the reasons you mentioned.
Well, I think you have to look at carriers. So, not everybody is going to be concerned about the moral and ethical responsibilities of sharing the road with other drivers, right? So, you have Hope Trans out there, you have Whitehawk, all these other carriers out there that have had catastrophic crashes because they employed people they shouldn't have hired. And that's why a lot of times when I speak at these conferences or we're out there, the big point that I push out there is who you hire, what you buy, and ultimately who and what you put on the highway is what's going to and should govern your mentality of that hiring and buying equipment and what you're putting out there. But again, not everyone's going to think about that. It's
Dusty on
what
LinkedIn.
Is the cheapest thing I can get?
Dusty on LinkedIn is echoing that. He says, wait until you're sitting on the witness stand trying to explain why your driver killed someone and you have to say, I don't know. No road test was ever done. Yeah, that's right. That situation, you're going to be forced in that situation and you're not going to have a compelling story to tell. And so that's probably going to be lights out for you. That's all it's going to take to end that carrier. But yeah, I mean, that's the only motivation really to get carriers to buy into this now, is that potential exposure. But so many motor carriers nowadays are so short-sighted that they're not even thinking to that. This is the battle we all fight on a daily basis with our, with our platforms and the motor carrier clients that we have, and we've said this a million times, but we're such a reactive industry when it comes to these types of things that we don't even start to think about these things until the bad accident happens. And now it's too late to implement any of these best practices that we all have preached about for years. And so, without having the regulatory mandate to do these types of things, you're really reliant on them being more proactive. And I just worry, I'm cynical that getting carriers to that point where they can be proactive in that regard is just not going to happen.
Well, as a thought here towards the end, he just stated it there and on that chat. Imagine if the threat of, we all hate these nuclear verdicts. We hate the big cost of all this stuff. Can you imagine if the threat of that went away for some carriers? You want to talk about turning trucking into the Wild West? Because as we've seen, regulatory wise, it's mediocre at best. And if the threat of those types of things went away, you imagine what carriers would do?
Yeah, you mean if carriers weren't on the hook for the negligence of their drivers?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, nobody would be doing anything. Yeah,
right, exactly. So I mean, it is a horrible thing for carriers, those big verdicts. But Jiminy Christmas, if that's the only thing that's keeping them semi in line for some of them, it's almost got to be there because we can't seem to do it regulatorily.
Yeah, right. All right, final thoughts, Rob, as we wrap up here.
No, I think that's probably it. Just who you hire and what you buy and who and what you put on the road is important. It's got an effect on carriers and everybody else that you share the road with.
All right. Well, like I said, this is kind of a developing issue. We will continue to track any breaking news in this regard and report out on it. So stay tuned. Subscribe to. We're posting all this stuff on all of our social media channels and also our newsletter, stuff like that. So if you want a source for that, check it out. Also, be sure to tune in next week. Like I said, we got another show next week. Next week, we're doing our annual year-end review, looking back over the last year, what has happened from a regulatory standpoint, what are the big developments, and also a look into 2026, what fleets and drivers can expect in terms of rulemaking activity and that type of stuff. So that's always a pretty popular show. It's going to be next Wednesday, December 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So you can find the details and add it to your calendar, read guest bios and that type of stuff over at trucksafelive.com. We'll hope to catch you then. Other than that, anything I missed, guys?
I don't think so.
I think we're good.
All right. Well, thanks for everybody for tuning in. Really appreciate it. We'll catch you next time. See ya.